Yesterday, President Trump signed a new executive order entitled Expanding Access to In Vitro Fertilization. Now, you may recall IVF became a lightning rod issue in the presidential election when the Alabama Supreme Court ruled in February of 2024 in favor of the personhood of embryos. Then candidate Trump promised to address the issue when he reached the White House, and now he has taken that first step. But this executive order only calls for a policy. It does not include the details of a policy. So what should that policy look like? Joining me now to think through a policy that has significant moral and ethical implications is Dr. Andrew Walker. He serves as the Associate Dean in the School of Theology and Associate Professor of Christian Ethics and Public Theology at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. He is also the director of the Carl F.H. Henry Institute for Evangelical Engagement. Dr. Walker, welcome back to Washington Watch. Thanks for joining us today.
Tony, thank you for inviting me on.
So first, let me get your reaction to the executive order.
So I think the thing that we want to be clear about right now is that we're still in a wait and see type position. The executive order did not actually provide a lot of guidance as to what the policies will look like. It just called for policy recommendations. And so I think that we have to just kind of take a wait and see approach and hope that the Trump administration doesn't go too far out on this issue, because there are real issues of human dignity at stake in this executive order.
All right, Dr. Walker, I don't want to take a wait and see. I want to shape I want to erect those boundaries. So let's talk about what those boundaries need to be, the guardrails, because this is quite significant, because we're talking about human life. And, you know, we clearly take stands for the unborn when it comes to abortion. I'm saying we, evangelicals. This becomes a little more complicated for some. They don't quite understand it. And I think the ramifications are the same. The consequences are the same for society if we devalue human life, no matter what stage it's in. So let's talk about those guardrails. What do we need to be concerned about? And let's start. Now, you know, I don't want to get too deep into the science. We know that this is not perfect, and not only like 40% of those who engage in IVF actually have success. Let's talk first in your lane. Let's talk about the moral and the ethical concerns here.
Sure. So the moral and ethical concerns is whenever IVF procedures are undertaken, they're called IVF cycles. What happens is more embryos are created than can be implanted. And there are multiple layers of moral concerns here. The first moral concern is that we're going outside the God-appointed, scriptural appointed boundaries for how we understand children to come into this world, which is through the marital act of husband and wife. And when we step outside those boundaries, we're going to introduce moral concerns. And that's where IVF steps in, where children are being fertilized outside the womb, literally in a Petri dish. In vitro means in glass. And so in vitro cycles, again, more embryos are created than can be implanted. That raises the question, what comes of those leftover embryos? And as Christians, we believe every single human being, regardless of their stage of development, is made in God's image. And that means we have human beings that are frozen, some are destroyed, some are donated to medical research. And all of this stems.
You've listed several there, so let's kind of take a couple of those and unpack those, because those can be addressed with the right policies. Now, there's a bigger issue that you talked about, this being done outside the womb. But let's talk about, number one, the excess embryos, because they are frozen, and they're either, and this would happen back in the Bush administration, was a big deal about the experimentation on these embryos. So that's one issue. But there are policies that we've seen, actually, other countries that tend to be more progressive, and I don't say that in a positive sense, I mean more liberal, but yet they've put limits on the number of embryos that can be created. So that's one policy recommendation, is it not?
It is, and that should be one of the things that I think conservatives and Christians want to bring to this conversation is an awareness that the IVF industry and the artificial reproductive technology industry at large is a highly unregulated industry, meaning there aren't many regulatory and legal constraints to this industry. And that means, for example, we don't even know how many frozen human beings, frozen embryos there are currently in the United States because there are no legal reporting requirements. And so something that we could hope for out of this executive order is that there could be tighter regulatory reform brought to this issue.
Andrew, that's one thing that concerns me a bit about this executive order is it actually calls for a reduction in regulation in order to drive down the cost, when there in fact is not much regulation at all. Now, there's some states, like my home state of Louisiana, actually has some pretty good restrictions, some regulations on here to protect both the couple seeking IVF, but also the embryos as well. So that's a concern I have in this executive order, that it doesn't want regulation.
And that's where, honestly, we have to take a wait and see approach. As I was reading the executive order myself, it seemed like the Trump administration is primed to want to protect the access to in vitro fertilization. And there are conversations about there being potential insurance mandates. But again, we don't know. And I think what we want to take in consideration here is there's an education campaign that has to go on. The broader public is really unaware of the intricacies of what goes on with in vitro fertilization. And that's even the case within the evangelical population as well. And so unfortunately, we're operating at a great cultural disadvantage on this issue. So as much as the policy considerations are important, and we want to argue for policies that protect human dignity, I think there's a major responsibility on the part of think tanks like FRC and for churches to go about the task of equipping our members to understand what really is at stake in the in vitro fertilization process.
So some of these excess embryos are frozen, sometimes indefinitely. Let's talk about the spiritual implications here of an embryo, a human embryo.
Sure, certainly. So, right out of the gate in Genesis chapter 1, we understand that every human being is made in God's image. And what Christian theology has to bear on this conversation is that we believe that being made in God's image is not something that is conferred on an individual outside the womb. Rather, the Christian teaching on the imago Dei is the idea that from the moment of conception or fertilization, that person is made in God's image, and they are owed, by right of their personhood, the ability to develop and mature into their full adulthood.
And Dr. Walker, the Scripture says it. Jeremiah 1 said, that the Lord called him, knew him in the womb. David made reference to this. So that's not a concept that you have to dig deep into Scripture to find. It's right there, front and center. So with that understanding, we're talking about human beings that have personhood, that have a spirit, that are frozen indefinitely, and possibly, in some cases, as we talked about a moment ago, they are experimented upon, used for medical experimentation. How can one rationalize that if they have a biblical view of life?
Well, we can't rationalize that if we have a biblical view of life. And that's why the education campaign is so central in this conversation, because a lot of evangelicals do support in vitro fertilization. Here's the good news, though, Tony, is that every time I've had a conversation with an otherwise pro-life evangelical, and they're made aware of the facts of what goes on in an IVF cycle, their natural pro-life instincts kind of flare up. And I have never had a conversation where someone hasn't moved to becoming alarmed about IVF. But again, there's an education deficit that we have to speak into. But I think what we also recognize here is that this is grounded on theological claims, grounded on biological claims and philosophical claims, that from the moment of conception, we are the same person at all stages of our development.
But what do we do with Scripture that biblical truth when it happens to be inconvenient for public policy and the trends of the day?
That's where Christians are called to speak prophetically, regardless of the social costs. One of the things we care about is witnessing to the truth for the sake of the truth. And oftentimes, as I hear from the FRC, one of our tasks as believers is to be watchmen on the wall who are out there kind of being the moral vanguards of society, prophetically witnessing to God's truth about how he has made us in his image and how law is called to recognize the truth of our embodiment and our human nature.
Now, Dr. Walker, I don't want to get deep into this because this is not, neither one of us our field of expertise, but there's enough general knowledge out there that infertility IVF is not a solution. It doesn't fix infertility. It works around it. There are other ways and other therapies that can be used, and so I think hopefully, and I did see kind of an opening in the executive order that it didn't just focus on IVF, but we may talk about other remedies to infertility, and I think that needs to be a part of the conversation as well.
I firmly agree. And I think we should step back and recognize that while evangelicals and social conservatives are right to have a lot of concerns about this executive order, we want to keep this in kind of perspective that the Trump White House has otherwise been a very pro-life White House. And even as we have concerns about this executive order, let's recognize what is in the words of the executive order itself, which is the recognition that children are a blessing and that we actually need more children. I don't recall previous administrations talking about the positive good of children like we are seeing in this White House. And so I want to see the wins and take the wins where we can get them.
Yeah, and I want this administration to be successful in that pursuit. And that's where I think thinking through some of these issues that frankly, as you said, it's an education issue. And if evangelicals have not thought a lot about this and the implications theologically, spiritually, morally to IVF, you can't expect those that just work on public policy to have thought through those ramifications either. So I do think it's important. With that backdrop, as you stated, we've got an administration that has put a high priority on family formation. As you pointed out, that is in the executive order. That's encouraging. We need to be prayerful as they pursue a policy, but also educating ourselves on the truth of Scripture and what the Scripture has to say about this. We just had about a minute and a half left, but what would be your advice to a hypothetical couple that might be considering IVF at this very moment?
Well, the first thing is I would want to ask a lot of questions because, again, in our culture, IVF is just kind of an assumed reality. And that assumption doesn't operate on the assumption that individuals are well informed about all of the moral kind of firewalls that are involved in IVF. And so I'd want to ask questions about, do they fully understand what is involved with IVF? And then I'd want to point them to Scripture to talk about what it means to bear God's image, who bears God's image. And then I would want to really just lead them to kind of working out the implications and consequences of their pro-life ethic. Tony, the good news here is that this is actually not that complex of a debate. If we have a biblical ethic on human dignity, all we really have to do is just carry that ethic that we care about with the unborn in the context of abortion, and to carry that forward in the context of IVF. Because at the end of the day, the debate really circles around who is our neighbor, who is made in God's image, and what is a human being. And Christians, I believe, have the best answers to these questions.
Right. It's a consistent application of that biblical truth.
Right.
Dr. Walker, thank you so much for joining us today. Always great to see you. Appreciate your insight.
Thank you so much.